A county maintenance worker stopped at the tree line when frost revealed something wrong. A shape where no shape belonged, stillness against fallen leaves, breath held by winter air, the radio crackling as tape markers appeared, boots crunching softly, and the knowledge settling that December had just claimed another secret. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred on the morning of December 22nd, 1989, in a narrow strip of county land behind an aging warehouse corridor outside Toms River, New Jersey. Holiday traffic moved along Route 9, while police units closed off a frozen access road that few noticed except sanitation trucks and hunters. The woman was identified later that day as Melissa Ann Carver, age 23, a retail clerk who had been reported missing after a Christmas party 3 nights earlier. She had been last seen wearing a wool coat bought on sale, practical shoes, and carrying a canvas bag filled with small gifts she had not yet delivered. Her life had intersected with the season the way many did, quietly and without warning. The scene was processed under gray skies, temperatures below freezing preserving details while complicating others. Investigators worked deliberately, documenting tire impressions hardened by cold, the absence of scattered belongings, and the way the ground suggested placement rather than collapse. No graphic harm was visible, only stillness and questions. Melissa Carver grew up in Ocean County, graduated high school with average marks, and held steady employment through her early 20s. She was known to keep schedules, to call home, to attend Thanksgiving dinners even when tired from work. In December of 1989, she shared a small apartment with a coworker near downtown, a practical arrangement during a year when rents rose and hours were uncertain. The week before Christmas had been busy. Local stores extended hours, seasonal music looped endlessly, and snow threatened but never quite arrived. On the evening of December 19th, Melissa attended a modest after-hours gathering at the store, a low-key affair with coffee, cookies, and a few beers. Records later confirmed she left before midnight. She did not arrive home. Her roommate reported her missing the next afternoon, a step taken after calls went unanswered, and a car remained parked where Melissa had left it. Missing person flyers were printed quickly, the black and white paper curling at the edges as they were taped to windows, gas stations, and the courthouse bulletin board. Local press ran a short notice, noting the holiday timing and the concern of family. Police canvassed the area around the store and the route between downtown and the apartment. Winter limited foot traffic, and many potential witnesses were traveling or distracted by preparations. The initial assumption was that she might have stayed with a friend, an assumption that faded as hours became days. The discovery shifted the case immediately from search to investigation. The medical examiner conducted a careful autopsy within 48 hours. Findings indicated death by asphyxia, consistent with manual pressure, without extensive injury. Time of death was estimated between midnight and 2 a.m. on December 20th, aligning with her last known movements. There were no signs of prolonged struggle at the recovery site. Toxicology revealed alcohol at low levels, consistent with social drinking and no drugs. Fingernail scrapings were collected, hair and fibers preserved, and clothing examined for trace evidence. In 1989, forensic technology was limited, but protocol demanded preservation for future testing. Detectives reconstructed Melissa's timeline through receipts, time cards, and phone records. She had clocked out at 10:45 p.m., purchased milk and bread at a nearby market at 11:10, and then vanished. The market clerk recalled her briefly, noting the weather and the holiday decorations, nothing unusual. A bus route ran nearby, but she typically walked. The path included poorly lit sections, bordered by industrial lots and woods. Patrol logs showed no calls in the area that night. The absence of witnesses frustrated investigators accustomed to denser urban cases. Attention turned to known offenders and associates. Melissa had no criminal history, no restraining orders, no known enemies. Interviews with coworkers and acquaintances revealed routine disagreements and ordinary relationships. A former boyfriend was located and cleared through alibi verification. A neighbor who often loitered near the bus stop was questioned and eliminated. Polygraph examinations were used selectively, reflecting practices of the era, but yielded no decisive leads. By early January, the case slowed. Detectives continued to work, but other demands pressed, and the holidays passed with unresolved grief. Throughout 1990 and into the early 90s, the investigation remained open. Evidence was stored in climate-controlled lockers, logs maintained, and periodic reviews conducted. Advances elsewhere in the country suggested future possibilities, but funding and time were limited. Melissa's family attended memorial services and continued to ask questions, receiving careful updates that offered little progress. The local newspaper marked anniversaries with brief mentions, respectful and restrained. In 1996, the department initiated a cold case review, prompted by a grant encouraging re-examination of unsolved homicides. Detectives pulled files, rechecked alibis, and revisited locations. The area where Melissa was found had changed, warehouses replaced by newer developments, but records showed ownership transfers and access routes. One detail resurfaced: a set of tire impressions photographed but never matched. At the time, no database existed to compare them widely. Another detail involved a man seen weeks earlier repairing equipment behind the warehouses, a contractor whose name appeared in a peripheral report. He had been interviewed briefly and released, his presence considered routine. The review expanded. Investigators tracked the contractor, now living out of state, and obtained employment records placing him elsewhere on the night in question. The lead closed. Progress remained incremental until 2004, when DNA testing capabilities advanced enough to analyze the preserved fingernail scrapings. The results produced a partial male profile, insufficient for identification but valuable. The profile was entered into state databases and flagged for future comparison. Years passed. The community aged. Retirements thinned institutional memory. In 2018, a renewed initiative funded by state resources revisited unsolved cases from the 80s. Melissa Carver's file was among them. Detectives digitized records, scanned photographs, and re-interviewed witnesses with modern techniques. One former coworker mentioned something previously overlooked. Melissa had complained of being followed briefly near the store weeks earlier, an unease dismissed at the time. The description was vague, but it aligned with a pattern seen in other cases. Investigators cross-referenced the partial DNA profile with genealogical databases, following legal protocols and court approvals. A potential familial link emerged to a man with roots in New Jersey who had worked seasonal jobs in 1989. The name was Thomas J. Harlan, then 32, a delivery driver with a minor criminal record for assault in the early 90s. Records placed him in Ocean County during the relevant period. Surveillance and background checks revealed he had since settled quietly, married, and avoided further trouble. Detectives obtained discarded DNA from Harlan through lawful means in early 2020. The comparison was conclusive. The profile matched the evidence preserved decades earlier. A warrant followed. Harlan was arrested in March, the news breaking softly at first, then spreading through local press with measured language. Court documents detailed the evidence linkage, including timeline consistency, opportunity, and the DNA match. Additional corroboration came from a former acquaintance who recalled Harlan mentioning an encounter gone wrong during a winter years earlier. The case proceeded through the courts with care. Defense motions challenged the age of evidence and the use of genealogical methods, but rulings upheld the procedures. In late 2022, Harlan pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter. He was sentenced to 30 years in state prison, eligibility for parole restricted by statute. The judge noted the long delay and the persistence of investigators and family. After the sentencing, there were no celebrations. Melissa Carver's name returned to the papers one final time, framed by quiet closure. A small plaque was placed near the courthouse among others, marking resolved cases. The warehouse corridor had long since been redeveloped, the tree line altered, but records remained. Winter returned each year, bringing holidays and memories. The file was closed, not forgotten, resting in cold archives where the truth had waited for the tools to speak. By the time winter of 1990 turned toward spring, Melissa Carver's case had settled into the long rhythm familiar to detectives who worked unresolved deaths. It did not disappear, but it lost the daily urgency that comes with fresh evidence. The investigative file grew heavier, layered with reports, supplemental notes, and correspondence. Each edition reflected careful work that yielded no arrest. The community continued forward, yet the absence remained, particularly for those old enough to measure time by seasons rather than headlines. Christmas lights were taken down, replaced by bare branches and salt-stained roads, while the memory of a young woman lost during the holidays lingered quietly. Detectives maintained a methodical approach. They rechecked timelines with the patience of men who had learned not to trust assumptions. Melissa's movements after leaving the grocery store were reconstructed repeatedly. Distances were measured. Walking times were calculated under winter conditions. Weather reports were reviewed to determine visibility and sound travel on that night. The conclusion remained consistent. She would have reached the darker industrial stretch within minutes. That vulnerability, combined with the lack of witnesses, suggested an offender familiar with the area, someone comfortable operating where routine patrols were sparse. Attention returned to the environment. The warehouse corridor behind Route 9 was active during daylight but nearly abandoned at night. Security logs were minimal. Many buildings relied on outdated alarm systems or none at all. Investigators cataloged businesses operating there in 1989, cross-referencing employee rosters, contractors, and delivery schedules. Dozens of names were generated, most eliminated through interviews or records showing absence. The work was slow, repetitive, and necessary. It reflected an understanding that resolution in such cases rarely came from a single revelation. The forensic limitations of the era shaped every decision. DNA technology was emerging but not yet reliable for small samples. The evidence preserved from Melissa's clothing and fingernails was cataloged with foresight, but testing options were few. Analysts focused instead on fibers, soil composition, and trace materials. The soil found on her shoes matched the recovery site, reinforcing the conclusion that she had been placed there shortly after death. No foreign soil suggested transport from afar. This narrowed the geographic focus, anchoring the crime close to where she disappeared. Media attention fluctuated. Local newspapers revisited the case on anniversaries, particularly in December, when editors framed it as a reminder of unfinished business. The tone remained restrained, reflecting both respect for the family and the sensibilities of an older readership accustomed to sober reporting. There were no sensational claims, only questions and reminders. Radio stations mentioned the case briefly during holiday programming, often between traffic updates and weather forecasts predicting snow that rarely arrived. Melissa's family cooperated fully with investigators, providing photographs, letters, and access to personal belongings. They avoided public speculation, choosing instead to trust the process. Their patience became part of the case narrative, cited internally as an example of quiet endurance. Detectives noted that such families often sustained investigations simply by remaining present, by answering the phone when years passed between calls. As the 1990s progressed, Ocean County changed. Population increased, roads expanded, and new developments replaced old industrial sites. These changes complicated retrospective analysis. Witnesses moved away or passed on. Memories faded. Yet the case was never closed. Periodic reviews ensured it remained active in status, even if inactive in momentum. Each review involved reading the file from beginning to end, a discipline designed to catch overlooked details. In 1995, a tip arrived from a man claiming to have overheard a confession during a bar conversation years earlier. Detectives tracked down the individuals mentioned. Interviews revealed inconsistencies, and the lead collapsed under scrutiny. The process, however, reinforced investigative rigor. Every claim, no matter how delayed, required verification. This approach prevented misdirection and preserved the integrity of the case. The first significant shift came with the department's cold case initiative in the mid-90s. Funded modestly, it encouraged detectives to revisit unsolved homicides using updated methods. Melissa Carver's file was among those selected. Investigators focused on re-interviewing witnesses, using structured techniques designed to prompt recall without suggestion. Some details sharpened. Others contradicted earlier statements. One coworker recalled seeing a van parked near the store on multiple occasions that winter. The description was vague, but it prompted a review of vehicle registrations associated with employees and contractors. Records showed several vans operating in the area, most tied to legitimate businesses. One belonged to a temporary delivery driver hired during the holiday rush. His name appeared briefly in the file but had not been explored deeply. At the time, his alibi placed him working late deliveries on the night Melissa disappeared. Payroll records supported this. The lead was documented and set aside. The late 1990s brought advances in forensic preservation standards. Evidence was re-examined to ensure compliance. Items were resealed, labeled, and stored under improved conditions. This step proved crucial years later. Detectives who handled the evidence understood they were working not only for the present but for future investigators who would inherit the case. In 2004, when DNA testing became more accessible, analysts revisited the fingernail scrapings. The partial profile generated was incomplete but usable. It did not match anyone in existing criminal databases. Still, it represented progress, a tangible link to the offender preserved through decades of technological change. The profile was entered into state systems and flagged for comparison. The years that followed were marked by quiet persistence. Detectives retired, replaced by younger officers trained in modern methods but guided by the files left behind. Each transition risked loss of context, yet the documentation mitigated that risk. The case became a teaching example within the department, illustrating the importance of thoroughness and patience. By the time the 2000 teens arrived, public interest in cold cases had grown nationally. Advances in DNA genealogy offered new possibilities. Legal frameworks evolved to allow limited use of public databases under strict oversight. Ocean County applied these tools cautiously. Melissa Carver's case met the criteria. The evidence was strong, preserved, and unsolved for decades. Approval was obtained through proper channels. Analysts uploaded the partial profile to genealogical platforms, searching for familial connections rather than direct matches. The process was slow, requiring careful interpretation. Eventually, a cluster emerged pointing toward a family with historical ties to New Jersey. The name Thomas J. Harlan appeared on the periphery, connected through distant relatives. Investigators began discreet background work. Harlan's employment history showed seasonal work in 1989, including deliveries near Route 9. He had lived temporarily in Ocean County during that winter. His criminal record included a later assault conviction, suggesting a capacity for violence. Surveillance confirmed his current residence and routine. Nothing outwardly suggested a man burdened by past crimes. That normalcy underscored the quiet menace of unresolved cases. In early 2020, detectives obtained discarded DNA from Harlan in a lawful manner. The comparison was definitive. The match confirmed what the evidence had held in silence for decades. An arrest warrant was prepared with meticulous attention to procedure, anticipating legal challenges rooted in the age of the case. The arrest occurred without incident. Local news reported it cautiously, emphasizing the length of the investigation and the role of modern science. For many residents, the name Melissa Carver resurfaced as a memory from another era. For older men who had followed the case through years of winter headlines, the development carried weight. It represented not closure yet, but accountability approaching. As the case moved toward court, prosecutors assembled a narrative grounded in records, timelines, and forensic linkage. The defense scrutinized every step, challenging the reliability of evidence preserved through decades. Hearings addressed these issues methodically. Judges ruled based on established precedent, affirming the admissibility of the DNA match and the investigative process. The proceedings unfolded against the backdrop of another winter, with holiday decorations returning to streets that had changed since 1989. For Melissa Carver's family, the season carried renewed gravity. The promise of resolution, long deferred, now approached within the measured cadence of the legal system. As pretrial motions concluded, the case entered a phase defined less by investigation and more by documentation. Prosecutors assembled a chronological record designed to withstand scrutiny from defense counsel and the court. Every movement of Melissa Carver during the final days of her life was mapped again, this time with the clarity of hindsight and the discipline required for a decades-old prosecution. Phone records, employment logs, and contemporaneous police notes were aligned to demonstrate consistency rather than speculation. The objective was not emotional appeal but factual stability, a presentation suited to a courtroom where time itself had become an adversary. Expert witnesses prepared reports explaining forensic preservation practices from the late 1980s. They described how evidence had been sealed, stored, and re-examined, emphasizing continuity of custody. The fingernail scrapings, once considered marginal, were now central. Analysts detailed how partial profiles could remain viable and how modern methods allowed interpretation without altering original samples. The explanation was technical, restrained, and necessary, anticipating jurors who might question how science could reach backward across 30 years. The defense strategy focused on doubt born of delay. Motions highlighted faded memories, deceased witnesses, and changed landscapes. They argued that the passage of time eroded reliability. Prosecutors responded by emphasizing that physical evidence does not forget, and that the absence of earlier technology should not shield accountability once technology matured. The court accepted this reasoning, noting precedent that allowed cold cases to proceed when evidence met contemporary standards. Public reaction in Ocean County was measured. There were no demonstrations or dramatic gatherings. Older residents recalled the case from brief newspaper mentions, while younger ones learned of it for the first time. The local press maintained a sober tone, framing the proceedings as an example of procedural persistence rather than spectacle. Editorials avoided judgment, focusing instead on the significance of lawful resolution. As winter deepened, the trial date approached. Court schedules adjusted to accommodate expert testimony expected to span days. The courthouse itself reflected the season, with salt tracked across stone floors and coats draped over benches. The environment underscored the continuity between past and present, a place where decades could converge within a single room. Before trial, Thomas J. Harlan entered negotiations through counsel. The evidence, particularly the DNA match and corroborating circumstantial details, limited viable defenses. Prosecutors offered a plea that acknowledged the severity of the crime while accounting for evidentiary realities. The proposal reflected an understanding that certainty, even without a jury verdict, served the interests of justice in a case so old. In late autumn, Harlan accepted a plea agreement. He admitted responsibility for causing Melissa Carver's death during an encounter that escalated beyond control. The admission was recorded without dramatization, entered into the record as a matter of fact. The plea eliminated the need for a trial, sparing the family further uncertainty while securing a conviction grounded in evidence. Sentencing was scheduled for December, a deliberate choice reflecting the court's calendar rather than symbolism, yet one that resonated quietly. Victim impact statements were prepared and submitted in writing. They described loss without embellishment, focusing on absence measured in years rather than moments. The court acknowledged these statements, recognizing the prolonged nature of grief in unresolved cases. At sentencing, the judge reviewed the record methodically. The timeline of the crime, the investigative history, and the forensic developments were summarized. The court emphasized that the sentence reflected both the gravity of the offense and the rule of law governing punishment decades later. Harlan received a 30-year term, with parole eligibility constrained by statute. The judgment was entered without applause or protest. Following sentencing, law enforcement officials released a final statement. It outlined the procedural steps that led to resolution, credited advances in forensic science, and acknowledged the patience of the victim's family. The statement avoided triumph, instead framing the outcome as fulfillment of duty. The case status was officially changed to solved. The aftermath unfolded quietly. Melissa Carver's family visited the site where she had been found, now altered by development. They placed no permanent marker, choosing instead to remember privately. The department archived the file, preserving it for historical record and future study. Training materials incorporated the case, highlighting lessons in evidence preservation and long-term accountability. In the months that followed, Ocean County returned to routine rhythms. Winter gave way to spring, and then to another cycle of holidays. The story receded from headlines, replaced by current concerns. Yet for those who had followed it across decades, the resolution carried lasting significance. It affirmed that time does not negate responsibility and that methodical work, even when slow, can prevail. The case also influenced policy. Departments reviewed cold case inventories, assessing evidence preservation practices and opportunities for genealogical analysis within legal bounds. Grants supported further reviews, extending the impact beyond a single resolution. Melissa Carver's name appeared in internal reports as a reminder of what persistence could achieve. For the investigators who remained, many nearing retirement, the closure offered a rare conclusion. They reflected on the early days of the case, the limitations they faced, and the decisions made to preserve evidence despite uncertain futures. The outcome validated those choices. It demonstrated that restraint, documentation, and adherence to procedure could bridge generations of law enforcement. As December returned again, the community observed the season with familiar rituals. Decorations appeared, traffic slowed, and news cycles filled with weather forecasts and holiday events. The case of Melissa Carver no longer hovered as an unanswered question. It had become part of the county's history, resolved without spectacle, recorded with care. The solved status did not restore what was lost, but it altered the narrative from uncertainty to accountability. In the quiet aftermath, that distinction mattered. The cold case, once defined by absence, now rested within the bounds of the legal record, a testament to the endurance of evidence and the slow, deliberate arc of justice. With the legal process complete, attention turned inward within the institutions that had carried the case for more than 3 decades. Supervisors ordered a comprehensive internal review, not to reopen questions of guilt, but to document how the investigation had endured. Files were audited one final time. Evidence logs were reconciled against modern digital inventories. Each step was recorded as part of a closing memorandum that would remain attached to Melissa Carver's case permanently. For departments accustomed to unresolved endings, this level of finality was uncommon and deliberate. The review emphasized how early decisions shaped the outcome. The choice in 1989 to preserve seemingly minor forensic material was highlighted repeatedly. At the time, fingernail scrapings were routine, often yielding nothing usable, yet protocol was followed without exception. That adherence, rather than intuition or luck, became the cornerstone of eventual resolution. Investigators noted that many cases from the era lacked such preservation, limiting future options. Melissa Carver's case stood apart for that reason alone. Training units incorporated the case into instructional programs for new detectives. The material was presented without dramatization, focusing instead on procedural discipline. Recruits studied the original crime scene photographs, the handwritten notes, and the gradual evolution of the investigation. Instructors emphasized patience, reminding trainees that outcomes were not always measured in months or even years. The lesson was clear. An investigation conducted correctly could outlive the careers of those who began it. Beyond law enforcement, the case influenced prosecutorial practices. The county prosecutor's office updated guidelines for handling cold cases, particularly those involving emerging forensic technologies. Policies were refined to ensure transparency, judicial oversight, and respect for privacy when using genealogical databases. Melissa Carver's case was cited in internal policy discussions as an example of lawful application that withstood defense challenges. Community response continued to remain subdued. There were no memorial events organized by the town, no public ceremonies. Instead, the resolution settled into conversation quietly, often recalled by older residents during winter gatherings. Men who had followed the case through years of brief newspaper notices spoke of it in measured terms, noting the rarity of such closure. The discussion rarely focused on the offender. Attention remained on the fact that the question, long unanswered, finally had an ending. Local media revisited the story one final time near the first anniversary of the arrest. The coverage focused on the investigative timeline rather than personal details. Journalists reviewed how records from the late 1980s had been re-examined using modern tools. The tone was reflective, acknowledging both progress and the limitations that had delayed justice. No attempt was made to sensationalize the outcome. For Melissa Carver's family, life continued within a framework reshaped by resolution. The sentence did not restore what had been taken, but it ended the uncertainty that had followed every December since 1989. The family chose not to engage publicly beyond a brief written statement thanking investigators. They declined interviews, preferring privacy after decades of waiting. The offender, now serving his sentence, became a marginal figure in the broader narrative. Prison records documented his intake and classification without comment. Appeals were limited by the plea agreement and the strength of the evidence. Legal analysts noted that the case illustrated how advancements in forensic science could intersect with accountability, even when offenders had lived quietly for years. The physical landscape associated with the crime continued to evolve. The warehouse corridor where Melissa was found had been transformed into a commercial area with new roads and lighting. Few visitors would recognize it as the site of a decades-old investigation. County records, however, preserved the original maps and photographs. Those materials were archived alongside zoning documents, an acknowledgement that history persisted beneath development. Within the courthouse, the case file occupied a place among other resolved matters. Clerks ensured that digital and physical records matched. The file was marked closed but retained under permanent storage. It would remain accessible for research, audits, or legal reference. The designation carried weight. It signified that the state considered its obligation fulfilled. Reflections from investigators revealed a consistent theme. The case reinforced trust in process over instinct. Many recalled moments of frustration during the early years, when leads failed and attention drifted elsewhere. Yet the structure of the investigation ensured continuity. Each detective, regardless of tenure, approached the file as a custodian rather than an owner. That approach prevented the erosion that often accompanies long-term cases. As subsequent winters passed, the holidays returned without the shadow of unresolved questions. Thanksgiving gatherings, Christmas services, and New Year observances continued in Ocean County as they always had. For those aware of the case, the season now carried a different association. It marked not only loss, but resolution achieved through lawful means. The case also prompted renewed interest in other unsolved investigations from the same era. Detectives reviewed inventories, identifying evidence suitable for modern testing. Families of other victims were contacted cautiously, informed of potential developments without guarantees. Melissa Carver's case became a reference point, illustrating both possibility and restraint. Academic circles took notice as well. Criminal justice programs analyzed the case in coursework, examining ethical considerations surrounding delayed prosecutions and evolving technology. Discussions emphasized the balance between innovation and rights, noting that successful resolution depended on careful adherence to legal standards. The case was presented as a model rather than an anomaly. In the years following resolution, institutional memory gradually shifted. New personnel learned of the case through training materials rather than personal experience. Yet its influence persisted in policies, procedures, and attitudes toward evidence preservation. The story became less about a single crime and more about the systems that sustained the search for truth. As the 35th anniversary of Melissa Carver's death approached, there were no formal observances. The family marked the date privately. Law enforcement acknowledged it internally, noting the milestone in a brief memorandum. The absence of public ceremony reflected the tone that had defined the case from beginning to end. The cold case, once emblematic of uncertainty, now represented the capacity of methodical work to endure. It demonstrated that justice need not be immediate to be legitimate. The long arc of the investigation, shaped by patience and procedure, concluded not with spectacle but with record entries and quiet acknowledgement. In that quiet, the case found its place. Not as a cautionary tale filled with sensational detail, but as a documented account of how evidence, preserved and respected, could eventually speak. The resolution did not erase the past, but it closed a chapter that had remained open for far too long. The final chapter of the investigation unfolded not with urgency, but with reflection, shaped by the understanding that closure, when delayed for decades, carries a different weight. The resolution of Melissa Ann Carver's case altered no daily routines in Ocean County, yet it settled into the collective memory with permanence. It became one of those stories older residents referenced quietly, often during winter evenings when conversation slowed and the past felt nearer than usual. Law enforcement leadership documented the outcome in annual reports, noting the case as an example of procedural endurance rather than innovation alone. The emphasis remained on fundamentals, accurate documentation, lawful evidence handling, and continuity across generations of investigators. Advances in science had provided the final link, but the foundation had been laid long before technology could deliver answers. Without that foundation, no breakthrough would have mattered. The courthouse retained the record as part of its permanent archive. Clerks ensured that sentencing transcripts, evidentiary rulings, and investigative summaries were preserved alongside original reports from 1989. The physical weight of the file reflected the passage of time, pages yellowed but intact, margins filled with careful notation. It stood as a reminder that justice often advances quietly, page by page, without spectacle. Within the community, the case gradually receded into history. It was mentioned less frequently with each passing year, not out of indifference, but because resolution allowed it to rest. For many older men who had followed the case from its beginning, the ending reinforced a belief shaped by long experience. That persistence, not speed, defined meaningful outcomes. The holidays returned annually without the unresolved question that had once lingered beneath seasonal routines. Melissa Carver's name appeared occasionally in internal training materials and academic discussions, but rarely in public discourse. When it did, the context remained restrained. The focus stayed on the process rather than the crime itself. This approach aligned with the tone that had characterized the investigation from discovery to sentencing. There were no dramatic reconstructions, no embellished narratives, only facts assembled over time. The offender's incarceration proceeded without incident. Prison records reflected routine classification and placement. Appeals were minimal and unsuccessful. The legal system treated the case as it would any other resolved matter, without special designation beyond its age. That normalcy underscored a central principle of the justice process. Time does not alter accountability once guilt is lawfully established. As years passed, the physical spaces associated with the case continued to change. Roads were widened, buildings replaced, and neighborhoods expanded. Yet the archival maps and photographs preserved the original environment, allowing future investigators and researchers to understand the context that once existed. These materials served as a bridge between eras, connecting a winter night in 1989 to the present. The family of Melissa Carver maintained privacy, choosing not to transform resolution into public advocacy. Their decision reflected a personal understanding of closure, defined not by recognition but by certainty. They marked milestones privately, away from cameras and public statements. Their restraint mirrored the tone of the investigation itself, steady and unadorned. Institutionally, the case influenced long-term planning. Departments assessed unsolved cases with renewed attention to evidence viability. Policies emphasized preservation, even when immediate value seemed limited. Supervisors reminded personnel that the future often belonged to tools not yet available. Melissa Carver's case became a reference point for that philosophy. The broader implications extended beyond a single county. Conferences and professional forums referenced the investigation when discussing cold case management. Presentations highlighted the importance of legal compliance when using emerging technologies. The case illustrated how careful adherence to rights and procedure could coexist with innovation. As each December arrived, the season carried layered meaning for those who remembered. Thanksgiving gatherings, Christmas services, and New Year reflections continued as they always had, yet the unresolved absence that once accompanied them was gone. The case no longer represented an open wound, but a scar acknowledged and healed as much as possible under the circumstances. The story's conclusion offered no dramatic moral, only a reaffirmation of institutional responsibility. Justice, when delayed, remained justice if achieved lawfully and thoughtfully. The investigation demonstrated that restraint, patience, and respect for process could sustain efforts across decades without distortion. In professional circles, the case prompted discussion about the emotional endurance required of investigators. Many who had touched the file early in their careers never saw its resolution, yet their work contributed directly to the outcome. This reality reinforced a culture of shared responsibility rather than individual recognition. The archival closure of the case did not signal an end to learning. Each resolved matter added to collective understanding, shaping future responses to similar challenges. Melissa Carver's case joined that continuum, informing practices that would benefit others whose stories remained unfinished. Ultimately, the resolution did not redefine Ocean County, nor did it alter the course of its daily life. Its significance lay in quieter affirmation. It showed that unanswered questions could persist without being forgotten, that evidence could endure, and that accountability could arrive even after long silence. The cold case concluded without ceremony. A file closed, a sentence served, a name returned to rest within the historical record. In that restraint, the ending matched the beginning, grounded in method, documentation, and the slow, deliberate work of justice carried forward until the truth could finally be spoken and recorded.